thank all of you. Thank all of you very much. And thanks, IHMC. It's pretty remarkable to come here and see the technologies being developed, but more than just the technologies, to understand the depth of thinking about this human species, us, that's going on that drives this. It's not driven by the desire for technology. It's something human-centered. Thanks for the people in government who are here. I really appreciate your coming. I don't come with easy solutions, one solution, the answer. Tonight I'm going to talk not about Pensacola. I'm going to talk about a global context. I'm going to talk about Bridgeport, Connecticut, this Rebuild by Design exercise, and I'm going to talk about New Orleans. So it's a lot, but I think I'm the only speaker, so we should have time. You know, those two words up there, not mine, but palimpsest and terraform are maybe a little challenging, but a palimpsest, you know, is a piece of paper that's been erased and rewritten and erased and rewritten, a scroll or something. And in some ways, it implies the story that urban design is, that planning is. You know, we rewrite the story. It's also a bit the land that we rework, because these cities are renovations. They're not green fields. This is not seaside, all right? But terraform is this other idea, which is more scientific a bit, that we actually are intelligent creatures that can shape the land to the use we need. You know, it's a science fiction term almost, right? The people come in and they mine the planet. Well, we don't want to mine the planet, but we want to know what we're doing as we shape the planet. So, you know, this comes from trouble, the condition in New Orleans. This comes from trouble we've had and trouble we know we will have, the disappearing delta, the floods we know, the epical flood of Katrina that put the city under water. And the force of that water that came at us. So as I show this, I guess we know this is getting toward the season, isn't it? So so if you want to have a perspective about water, you really need to think about it holistically. And when Katrina hit us, we sort of woke up from being the sleepy city that, you know, the tourists loved and care forgot, to really connected into this world. You know, the phrase from the 60s of the global village. Well, New Orleans connected directly into that. And then we connected into this idea that I come from this background, and it's appropriate at IHMC, this background of science. And what are we going to do about this? What's the big program we need to be able to figure this out? So in coastal terms, in climate terms, in ocean terms, this is a big project we have ahead of us. You know, one of our pitches on the Gulf Coast is we should embrace this, because if we will wake up, we can become masters in this. And there's some business to be done. You know, it's business we're going to do by loss, or a business we do by gain. I find the world curious, because I'm from really a nowhere place. You're going to see some of the landscape around where I come from. It's curious, right, that this sets up that the highest places and the lowest places are exactly opposite in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, for me, I'm bothered by things like this, or worry. And the Nile is in there with Cairo, and that goes north, right? And our river comes south. But if you understand the global village, you understand that there are places you learn from otherwise and other than your place, and there are conditions that don't appear to be exactly yours, that have principles involved, and those are things like physics and biology often, that are pretty important. But the value of water itself, this is the first bend in the river, in the Yangtze River. If this did not do that, China would not be China. This is the watershed in China that comes out of Tibet, and politically an essential reason that China cares about Tibet. But if you take it otherwise, and I'll come here in just a second, but if you take it, this is the head of the Rhine watershed. So if you want to think about the mouth of the river, if you want to think about the mouth of the Mississippi, you need also to think about the source of that. So the disconnectedness that's happened in our time, where this is not connected to me anymore, it's not true. It all connects. I don't know in what life, in what time, in what period, but there's a return period. And so in New York area, you know, they've discovered a lot of things, including the Dutch now, which is curious. And Rami Diaz is in the back, who works with me and helps greatly. We were assigned in Rebuild by Design to lead a team as it developed in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I was fortunate and got to go to school in New Haven. And if you look at that, you see those watersheds coming down on that coast, and you see a really nice barrier island if I'm behind there, right? Well, and you see Long Island. But if we start to pay attention to that and we look at how water is managed in Bridgeport and the conditions of that water, it's the upland condition and then the river condition and then the coastal condition. They're all factoring. It's not one. So in the way we think of water, there are really four forces of water. You know, there's the water that comes down at you, and there's the water that comes in at you. There's the water that falls down, and in New Orleans, as you'll see, it's very important that we think about the groundwater. It's very important that we understand this water underneath us, and it's out of sight, so it's really hard to keep that in mind. But if you don't factor the four forces of water, then you're missing it. So you have to think holistically again. So in Bridgeport, you know, they didn't have that bad a storm, so we've gotten $10 million to continue planning, design, and build a little thing in Bridgeport. You know, they weren't hit very hard. You see what Sandy did to them. This is a public housing project, and you see the current worst case is much worse. And the climate scientists and geologists and the people who are certain about things that I'm not certain about, but I do fear, say that by 2100, you see how much higher that water could be in storm. Well, what do we do? You know, how do we work? Do we tell people to run away, move? That's a nice place to be, right? Pensacola and New Orleans, these are nice places. How do we work there? Well, if you look at the landform there, and that's red mark, I believe, is the 100-foot line, right? More or less. But you see the peninsula landform that's there in Bridgeport, right? And we'll compare this in a little bit to Pensacola, all right? This is good topography. This is not a place like where I come from where you have to move a long way to get 20 feet above sea level. You have to move a long way to get 300 feet above sea level. I'm 300 feet above sea level in no time here. That doesn't mean that if I live in that place down at the bottom, I don't want to stay. And if you're the mayor of Bridgeport, which is 16 square miles, you're in trouble because your tax base is all in those places and you're property tax constrained, and Connecticut's even more a mess than Louisiana, and I'll stay out of the Florida thing for tonight. But they don't have any tax revenues, right? It's hospitals, so what do you do if you're the mayor trying to run a place and you need taxes? You need income to support this. Do you just run back out of that storm surge area? Especially when you look at the condition, and this is much worse than what you have, right? This is a city, this is the largest city in Connecticut. It's only about 200,000 people. But you see what the downtown looks like. That's not an unusual day. That's downtown, Bridgeport, Connecticut. And this is within, if we had a decent train system in the U.S., this would be within less than an hour from Grand Central Station, right? This location is hard to beat, yet something plagues the place. So one of the things we took away from this is that it's an economic question also. It is also an ecological question, and those two things are not separate. They are, in fact, inherently related. So we say wet edges are rich, and you know that because you eat the seafood, and we eat the seafood at the edge, and we know that the life's at the edge. So it's really not a matter of turning our back from the edge, but it's a matter of standing at the edge, you know, mining the edge, but not being so fixed that we get hit. So what we said then in Bridgeport is let's think in framework terms, and let's think about green edges and soft edges so we don't harden first. We actually let this green edge develop along the sea and the river. And then we said at certain places we do need to fortify, okay? So the fortification came not first but second. And then third, we said, well, we got to have some economic drivers, because I should have seen it in New Orleans, right? You remember the people who were there. They were the poor people, right? There is no resilience in poverty. So you can't leave half the people behind. You've got to bring all the people along, and you have to look for gainful employment in this process. America in 1951, right? We knew this. And so you work with people. We have a methodology where we really try to go in and we prepare a lot, and then we do workshops with people to try to lay out and drawing, and not like the charrette process of the new urbanists exactly, but laying out, working with people, stakeholders, to try to come up with what the projects would be. And so then we created this overall plan for Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is a great landmass, right? You see those rivers coming down there. There's pollution in the rivers, but it's not so terrible. It's abatable. So then you look at the city, and I'm going to show you some slides and some images, and they start out with a really good thing, which is an Olmsted Park at the bottom at the sea, so they don't get damaged here because they put the green space in the right place a long time ago. And then, why won't it move? It moved twice. So then what do you do with the edge of that? Well, I think you almost have this developing, this living shoreline with Long Island Sound. And then as you develop that, the orange line is the barrier, the berm, which is a progressive development. It's really just a bump, right, in the landscape, threaded through the parks at the back to protect the other things that are in there, which include some valuable assets. If you move just away from that, because to work in this kind of, to think in this way, you have to develop a lens or a window that's the right size. You can't think about the whole thing at once. You have to find your scale. You have to focus in on your computer screen to the right scale. So there's this area that Bridgeport has, and part of the history, which is called Black Rock, which is very, very progressive in environmental terms. Waste energy. The mayor there wants to be the green mayor of New England. And so, then they have a history of making things. I think anybody who can make things, we want to say. Sikorsky Helicopters, primary, and they made the Dymaxion car there. They have a history of making. So building on that, it's doing it too fast. Building on it, we said, well, if we're going to have this energy distribution here, we can use a raised street system as part of the flood defense system and distribute the power through that. So it's basically looking at elevating infrastructure, which has happened before. It happened in Portland, Oregon, so that then progressively the things at the edge raise themselves alongside it. So it's what's public, what's private, and how do they benefit and work together. And then in the end of that, you have this flood defense system for that part of the city too, that then feeds and powers the downtown. So then the downtown of Bridgeport, which is this asset that's cut up by a highway particularly, but it's a noble sort of place, but it presents about the worst face it can to you. You come off the train and you got a chain link fence looking at you, and that's the way you're supposed to go in, and it doesn't really have a port and it doesn't really have a bridge. So, what we suggested, we build a bridge, because there's a bridge that's broken that tore up the city. So a lot of this stuff, you want to couple the flood protection thing with the economic thing and with the social and environmental. You're trying to connect it all, and in this case, a new train station for Bridgeport will be in the offing because they certainly need one. That's all the Amtrak, the big scale thinking about the Northeast Corridor comes through Bridgeport. And as you see that, then what would be this bridge, this new bridge that's just connecting those two parts of town. And then going up, because we'll move on back toward our part of the country, you see this ice, and we don't see that much here. But that's the Pequannock River, which is this beautiful river, and it has another Olmsted Park at the top of it. So again, the green space assets are vital to the city, and water management in the park is the city scale. So then if you look at this, it's also what feeds into that river, and this is a problem that I think some of you know locally, which is that the waterways were covered up. And as the waterways are covered up, water has its way, okay? It's just about as like taxes or death or something, Only it's better than either of those two things, I think. So what do you do with it instead of letting it just be in somebody's backyard crumbling in? How do we together take advantage of that? And how do you then reimagine this riverfront, this waterfront, so that it's vital in there? And how do you say yes to this man who's making that much money out of 140 linear feet of oyster way? And he's proud of that. You can see the Yankee there, can't you? And then so we say we expand the oyster bed because it's a certain depth. And then how do we get aquaculture to create economy? And so you get all those things working together. You're looking for multiple wins. You can't do one by one. And then you look at this condition, which is almost the end of the Bridgeport case, but the historics on the left, the currents on the right, on the middle, and what we proposed on the right, which is to uncover this waterway, because you see what happened to the river, right? It's got a low-level shopping center built on top of it. And you see where it goes under, right? The water's beautiful. Well, the shopping center's really not. And so how do you use that to redevelop? And how do you, I'm from New Orleans, how do you work with the people so that it's equitable and progressive, and you can do this over time, and people become shareholders in this place? So then you get this condition that's possible in Bridgeport, and over time, it now becomes their ambition, right? This is not something you can do in a year. You can do other things in a year. So this is just your scale comparison here of the two places, and you can see that there are similarities in landscape, though you never get to the Himalaya. It's not really the Himalaya that are above Bridgeport. So this case geographically has things to do with New Orleans, but topographically it also has things to do with the Connecticut peninsulas, all right? I come from a poor place. But when I was a boy, a little bitty boy, there was a man who drowned in the street with a flood, a rainfall flood. And that sign is still there, and you can see they shot at it a few times. But this was done right away after the storm. And what they did was they took this landscape that's for Louisiana steep, right? The runoff from that was flooding this little town, Plain Dealing, Louisiana. And they built this lake, and that stopped the flooding. But it's a progressive series of lakes. It's not one, and the dam and the height and so forth. So water management's pretty much farmer thinking in a lot of cases. But it takes a lot more understanding. And as the water system comes down, because we're moving now in this set of images to New Orleans, all right? As you start down this watershed, you see that nature, this is a place where people don't much live anymore, okay? But nature's doing fine. And if we don't understand the value of this natural system, this is the Red River, which then comes down as it comes through the middle of Louisiana and creates these kind of conditions, and then closer to the middle of the state becomes much muddier, right? And then it comes into this prairie condition down near New Orleans before it just becomes water, And so most of you have been to New Orleans, no show of hands, please, but yeah. Well, those of you who haven't, come. But when you're coming into New Orleans, from the west, it's all water, and then that's the end of the water. But now this is about the sort of tutorial water management. Make sure you understand what I'm saying and our work in context, all right? So this water that's coming to New Orleans can also overflow the Mississippi River, right? We're in a special condition, and one that America needs. But this is a condition where they've had to push the water through the Bonacure spillway into Lake Pontchartrain. And that sediment, which is what we need to build the delta, is in the lake where we don't need the sediment. So getting the resource where you need the resource is part of the objective that we need to set. We don't want the sediment in the lake, we want it in the delta. But if you start to look now, you see the lake still cloudy in that. You start to look at the delta here, well, it's not really there very much. So again, now if we work our way back up, we're also not using the river to put the sediment back in the delta, right? So it's dying. It's just dying. I mean, we're losing football field as I talk, right? Which is not okay. And it's not okay as a flood defense system, because the first line of defense in Louisiana, in New Orleans, is not this, but the wetland. You don't have the wetland. New Orleans was sited in a very difficult place, but it had the wetlands to protect it. It does not much anymore. We do have a phenomenal, if troublesome to operate, flood defense system, right? So we have this system. This is what the Corps built, $14 billion, and maybe y'all hate us for it, I don't know, but it's important, but we have to maintain this. And we don't have that many people. So you have to find some way to maintain this stuff, which doesn't really have secondary benefits, all right? Its primary purpose is its only purpose. And it's not the Golden Gate Bridge. It's good looking. But people aren't going to pay and go and see that. And if you look at the second line of it, this is the best looking condition almost in some ways at Lake Pontchartrain, where you get another line of defense, the levees, Okay, that was the big closure structure. And then you get this condition, which is a nice day and a white line. But again, this doesn't stay there forever without maintenance, right? And you have to operate gates and so forth. So this is the flood defense side of it. In New Orleans, what we really have that distinguishes us is the pumping system. We have a powerful pumping system. I mean, we have the largest pump in the world at the West Bank closure structure now. These things, this was the state of the art, 1920. This is what allowed that. It still works, okay? It still works. It has incredible cost to the landscape, okay? So the remedy that creates new problems is not a long-term answer left alone. So it's part of our solution, but we have that tool. And we still have this tool, which is the way that architecture, because I am an architect, terraform implies architect, okay? I hope you guys don't think I've gone to the soft side, you know? But this is a building we worked on a long time ago from the 18th century, right? This is how people built. You know, they raised the house, they knew the flood, and they built the wood above, masonry below, water could go through. This is still a good technique in places like we live, okay? Like we live here. And you see that here, raised houses. Common sense, right? So what other tools do we have? You know, I mean, so this is homage to the 60s or something. And you see the cost was good. I mean, what other access to tools do we have? What other tools are in our kit? Culture, valuable tool. You know, in New Orleans after the storm, everybody wanted their community back. And everybody wants, and you in Pensacola have an incredibly valuable culture. You're the center of this place because you have this culture. You can't sacrifice that, but you can't stay dry. I mean, this is not going to ward off the rain, and this one will help you, but it's not going to answer 22 inches in 24 hours or whatever it was. You understand? So you have to have more knowledge and tools, and one of the tools we have is knowledge. And in the global village, we now have this ability to share knowledge. And, you know, if you connect to people who know more than you, you probably have a good dinner conversation and feel better tomorrow morning, and then you can do more tomorrow afternoon. So we became, you know, like depending on the kindness of strangers for a while, and worked with the Dutch Embassy and the American Planning Association, and really just initiated this process that became known as Dutch Dialogues. So this is eventually, well, it was intentionally a self-help process, but we did not really try to deal with the coastal side. You know, the Category 5 term that we hate the thought of right now. That was the idea, the mythic idea of getting Category 5 protection for New Orleans. The Dutch do that in three ways. You know, they do it with the barriers, and they do it with the levees. And the third component, and they're not looking for 1 in 100, they're looking for 10,000, right? The third is urban water management. So in New Orleans, you see the solution that was put forward by the Lake Pontchartrain Levee Foundation, which was elevate, I showed you those two, and evacuate. So that third is not really, as a small business owner with 25 people, the best solution. Running every time out of New Orleans that there's a storm in the Gulf is expensive. And besides, the risk reduction, we have a hurricane risk reduction system. We do not have a flood protection system by the Corps of Engineers. The residual risk that's by far the highest is rainfall, okay? We pay insurance based upon flood loss from rainfall as much as, and more than now, the hurricane. So what is a ground-up approach? And in our methodology, a ground-up approach is, I'm from plain dealing, right? So it's from the ground. It's actually working with the soils and water and the biodiversity, working with what's in the ground, working up through the infrastructure, and then coming to the habitation level where we exist, to the buildings. Ground up in most of American planning is talk to the people, right? We have a cup of coffee. We're going to get your... Well, some of these problems exceed our communal knowledge, right? But if you ignore this, what's underneath the city of New Orleans, I take it that most of you can orient yourselves to this map and you know where the river is, you see it cutting through and you see the lake and you see the erosion of the wetlands, but you see the underlying strata, and these soils go from bad to worse, but they, when they get bad, they get really bad, okay, on that lake shore. And, and then you can see underlying geological features in there. So to think about Pensacola, we have to think about what's in the ground. What is the ground? Where is the clay? Where is the sand? What are the other structures? Where were the creek beds? These things inform solutions, okay? You can't have a solution without doing some research, and geology becomes part of the research. You also need history, because if you don't understand the history of development, you probably miss some things that would be obvious if you just study it. I was a history student in school, and we've forgotten it. My son doesn't. Well, he's going to take some history next year. He tells me he's here. So the history of the land in New Orleans isn't that we were below sea level. I won't try to explain these drawings. All this work's on Living with Water. You can look at it, and this is done with a great team. But you can see, as this thing developed over time, at the bottom now is where we are. This relatively absurd city, right? That's half below sea level with a ridge going through the middle of it. The French Quarter's up at the edge on the river where we're all the way, 6 or 8 feet above sea level, maybe 12. And then down in the bottom, right, where the polar landscape is below the ridge, where we're below sea level and must live for as long as we live there under pump, right? So what analysis we made in this, what problems we identified, we try to simplify, and 3 seems to be a good number. And these are basic. No matter what, the drainage systems are overwhelmed, right? If we double the capacity of our drainage system, we would fix, they say, 40% of the flooding problem. Well, that's not a good investment, right? We then pump it out, and you've been to New Orleans, you know our streets, right? Well, it's not corruption. It's actually... They laugh too earnestly or easily. So, because we don't manage the jello, it falls apart. And even where it doesn't sink, it moves up and down. And then this third thing, this very perverse relationship we have to water. Don't look at it. This is really a terrible thing. It's dangerous, So we then try to make an economic case. Because if you can't make an economic case for what you do, and it has to be over time, you probably can't succeed in the United States, in the world. So we say here, you've got $8 billion worth of projected loss, current terms, from flooding by rainfall, okay? You've got $2.2 billion in subsidence damages. So you've got those costs building in, and it's because you're doing it this way. You're pumping it and draining it. That's us, not you, okay? You have some things that are doing some of this other, maybe not at the scale that need to be. So the paradigm shift is to change from pump and drain to slow it down, store it, and pump it only when you have to. In Rebuild by Design, Hoboken, New Jersey, 2 square miles, just got $250 million for that bottom line to do that, institute that in 2 square miles. And good democratic politics. But some things exceed politics, and I think water management is one of those basics that I'm not nearly as smart as Ken, but time and weather, this is from a movie, it's the same word in many languages. And when it's raining hard and the flood's rising, it's exactly the same word, right? Stop. Will it stop? How much longer, Lord, will it rain, right? So that connection is fundamental. You can model this. This is from a Room for the Rivers project, so that if you look this way from upper left and you start to see how the water flows through that landscape, there's an intention to what gets wet, okay? So designing so that it's safe to flood, and you have an intentional flood, you know where that is, and the people who live in those places understand that period of risk and return, seems to me to be reasonable if you want to live in places that are subject to water. Because no flooding comes with terrible consequence. And productive flooding is quite possible. So there's a detail there, and we could talk more about Room for the Rivers. That's the Dutch working together to manage water, okay? And compensating fairly the people affected. So we in New Orleans then said, well, we have this system. Remember the palimpsest or the renovation question? Well, we have projects being built today that I'd rather not have seen, major underground drainage structures that might have been built in 1950. Well, they're continuing, but we try to say, well, how do we use that system and renovate that system to split it at the ridge and do some other things? But so that our stormwater flows can still get out, because in almost any case you can imagine with the rainfall we get, like you, some point we have to pump. Some point it's got to go somewhere other than in my house or car. But it's also a problem for drought, because we get our subsidence when it's dry. So the system as we consider it, is also a dry weather system. Because in the dry weather, we actually need to take in water and move water and have it circulating. New Orleans is the land of opportunity. It's not Arkansas, really. It's New Orleans for water, because there are so many things you can do renovating and working with the pieces that are there that you can really create a water city. One of our themes is building America's water city. The idea that you want to be a water city scares some people, because we have this Atlantis thing that none of us have seen in our head. But at the end of that, it's a living system. It's not just a blue system, it's a green system. It's the things that live along the water, the tree planted by the, living water, that brings its fruit in its season. And it's this investment question. The Dutch are really good with money, huh? They invented the stock. They are penny pinching preachers, and they're my friends. But they know how to spend money well and time well. And which one is better? This is the New Orleans model on the left, and we didn't change it to dollars. Which is better? Which is going to give you more return on investment? So I think I know. And we made this case easy, and it's really, we could push these numbers a lot further. Basically a 4-to-1 return on investment with this program. So you have to make the economic case on return on investment. In the Netherlands, I make this talk, somebody comes up and said, when are they doing it? Oh, it's America, we don't always do things. But I'm, a space program patriot, right? None of that figured this, right? So it didn't calculate. We're not very good at calculating this yet, but in the future, people are going to know what this system's worth, this natural system is worth. And then it also doesn't really calculate the value of cooling, of shade. And shade comes with water, right? The living system. So if you can put more water in the landscape, this is St. Charles, that. This is what makes New Orleans habitable. In this season of the year. So and what's my advantage on the cooling bill? In 1936, Isaac Klein, who had been the meteorologist who was famous for the Galveston hurricane that wiped him out in 1900. He was living in New Orleans and measured that the ambient temperature had risen 2 degrees, I believe, because of the draining of groundwater in New Orleans. 1936 to 2014 is a long time to keep doing the same thing if it's got negative effects. So the opportunity of a disaster is to change. We've made a lot of progress. We are working at it more. There are these books. There are more books than this that you can look at online. You can print this out. It was put out in format that was easy to do, not esoteric, academic or coffee table form. So you can print that. Living with Water is the site. We had an incredible team. I'm going to show you some of this work now, if you can bear with me a bit more. People on the left were, the blue team was the Americans, and the orange team's the Dutch, but we were one. And you don't normally get Rotterdam and Amsterdam working together. Sometimes when there's something outside you, you are better. And I think that one of the things we were able to do in New Orleans was welcome, which is not the tradition, welcome other thinking. And that's been a real change. And now New Orleans has this opportunity to create this water industry. We need to, because we're living in this bowl, right? We're living on this island now that's a wall city. And this wall city's got to float along the river, toward the sea. There's this city down there that trades out of the Mississippi. And you see it there stretching out before you with the Gulf ever closer to it. And so let me say that we have different polders in New Orleans, different areas. St. Bernard is the lowest one. Lower Ninth Ward is in this polder. And the character of St. Bernard is very natural, rural. So how do you then use this water system to reinforce the place? Well, part of it is using the canal system, the drainage system, to engender a new, not only identity, because St. Bernard actually has a water identity, but economic base. And so you have this watershed coming down through that parish to the wetland at the back where they have tons of space and more storage. And then the line between the wetland, this is the lower Ninth Ward on the left there where the water's drawn in, and it's empty. But the line between nature and city is blurred. Because, in the old days in Copenhagen or something, I know that city a bit, there was a wall. They closed the gates. Beijing, there was a wall. They closed the gates. Well, that's not the city of the future. The natural aspect needs to be brought inside the city. We don't have our walls anymore. New Orleans does. But within the wall, you have to bring nature back and forth because that's where it's sustainable. It's not sustainable to put nature out there and the city in here all hard. You have to bring them together. So if you come to New Orleans, if you flew to New Orleans, which you wouldn't do, we couldn't do from here exactly, you'd land on that airport piece that's at the very bottom, right? And that's the end of water for your experience when you flew in. But that's what you had flown into, is that watery landscape, right? So this is Jefferson Parish, and this is not Pensacola, but it's Jefferson Parish. And as you come in, then you start to look at all these. Jefferson Parish is all paved, low level, developed from the 50s. The most difficult of the water problems of the area of Jefferson Parish, to keep it from flooding, because too much pavement, too little space, all built at one time, no bigger spaces. But they have highways, and along the highways, we don't couple water and transportation very much in America, which is not very bright, especially if you live in places like this, because you have that space, right, to put water. You also have, and this is one of the dark parts of the story, you also have these drainage things that are in the landscape. And then we did this experiment to raise it just quickly because this was a cut-off piece with them. And immediately people say it looks much better. And we said, yes, but in certain seasons you need to manage it down, and here's what you can do. The truth is, because the paradigm that we're operating under, that's really driven by the agency and the engineer, is so strong, this will be covered, right? They are currently moving, given 3 alternatives, to cover this. So it'll be another green, hot space. I try. And I'm pretty stubborn, so I'll probably make it. But this is another Jefferson Parish drainage condition. These are experiments in ugliness, I say sometimes, right? Geez, can't you do something better than that? But yes, you can, right? And do you think this has more value and is more likely to attract somebody who works for IHMC than something like the other one? But there are smart things done sometimes, and this is a park that actually built a little levee around it, and instead of flooding the neighborhood, the water's moved into the park. Now it's wet for a few hours, and those kids enjoy it, and they can't play ball for a day, but the neighborhood didn't flood, right? So parks are critical assets, and parks are at the scale of the city. So we have parks like you do that are higher than the land around them. That's kind of, my Dutch friends make fun of me for that, but they know I know better. Knowing and getting it done are not the same thing, and implementation becomes the most interesting thing to me now. How do you get it done? You can have a good idea. We can draw. So this is interesting because in one piece of Jefferson Parish, you see the wetlands back there where the airport was and all that. One piece still has large parcels of empty land, and they could do something that would be a different economic opportunity there, different housing type, which people need. Will they? I don't know, but we try, and this is the most subsidence-prone area of the whole place. This is sunk 8 feet below sea level, right? And that was the pump that did that. You don't have that problem exactly. You may have it a bit. So in watershed terms, you can say it's at whatever scale you want. Okay, this is uptown New Orleans drawn in the bend of the river. It could be the Garden District. But this line that comes down, if you look, is composed of streets that look like this. But certain of those streets don't have much infrastructure and can be rebuilt as streets that look like this, which peel off the water. Do you understand? You want to peel the water off every time you can. Hold the water higher. Once it's at the bottom, it's very hard to manage. So managing it up the slope is the first thing you try to do. But you can do it with infrastructure when you build a street. You can also do it in smaller scale, Garden District corner, you see the tree there, pushing it out, tearing up the street. Well, you can also peel off some water. It's marginal, right? But it also creates an awareness among the people about what's going on. And you create a better environment with that water into that place. Some things are more difficult. This is a key piece of the infrastructure in New Orleans. You see the line on the right, that's the plan, the Monticello Canal. And this carries a lot of water between Jefferson and Orleans parishes. And I was thrilled that Sunday I saw this and said, God, I'm from Plain Deland. This looks like where I come from, right? Dirt and grass, and this looks great. Well, I went to see Rami Monday morning. He was showing me what the Corps of Engineers is intending to do with it, right? Which is build a concrete trench and build a wall and continue this paradigm. You cannot underestimate how difficult it is for us to change. You know, the Bob Dylan line, any of you know Bob Dylan? I can change, I swear. I don't believe he thought he could. It's very difficult to change. But if you have a flood, it's time to try to change, right? I mean, this is no one's fault. It fell. But we have to try to change the way we think. So we have this opportunity there. So you see this floodway. We can more than double the safety aspect of this part of the city with this move by taking that and making it a floodway so that when it really rains, this is public, this is a railroad, empty land. Okay, this is not taking property from people who live there. And then at the end of all that, you can create whatever you want and put it on either side. But you have to get people to believe and work together, and you also have to be able to deliver what you promise. Okay? This is in front of Xavier there. You also have to know where within the system the element exists. So there's a famous urban geographer in New Orleans named Richard Campanella, and he thinks this is the most important one to show people what a canal would be like. But it's actually, you got to do the other one before you can do this one. So you need to know how the system is going to work so that you can understand which ones are time dependent, right? One of the things you want to try to do is reduce the interdependency of the pieces so you can do things more independently. Some cases you cannot. So then you would have this, which would be a far better front door for Xavier than the other. Also streets, bad soils. What do you do with the street? Well, you build the street with this rain garden alongside, which is really not just a ditch, it's enhanced underneath. And then that street then accumulates up into something more than that in wet condition. And in the west end, which some of you know, which is the drawing on the left, which is a vast open space, you can actually store a lot of water and manage subsidence. Try to think of doing more than one thing. And in this case, we're trying to make New Orleans aware of its opportunity to be a water place, because we don't actually even go to the lake anymore, right? Before the storm, some did, but it was for cheap restaurants. You haven't turned your back on the water as we have. You're still facing the sea. But you got to be able to count it. It's not, architects really can count. I mean, we have horrible reputations for spending all your money and, not giving you what you ask for. But this is an area of New Orleans. Just look at the way we looked at the whole thing was a water assignment. So this is the excess water that we can't pump. Okay, the amount of water we're going to flood beyond what the drainage system can handle, we need to store. Those are big areas because they're 10 times the area of Jackson Square, about to your waist. So those bars are not small. If you look as we pulled out this area over here, there's this one piece that's Pontchartrain Park and Gentilly Woods. This is where Lisa Jackson was from, Wendell Pierce, lots of other famous African-American neighborhood. But you see the exaggerated shape of it, and it's a watershed again, right? So if you can peel, and these are empty lots, because New Orleans has lots of empty property. So in the empty lots, you peel these in, and you get water in there, and what you can keep out of the canal is about half the water assignment before it ever got to the drainage system. So you need to be able to count it, right? And you need to do the research and the math and the engineering, but you've got to have then some vision that aggregates into more than just water storage in lots. It's got to become a neighborhood way, right? Because you've got to then enhance the property value of the place next to it enough to pay for it continuing. Because it's not going to be cheaper to live on the water probably, right? Insurance is probably not going down. So, okay, so we have these big opportunities in New Orleans, and I hope I'm not running long. There's just a bit more. This is our relationship, right, to water. We have these outfall canals. This is the way it is. But we have all these miles now with the flood defense system built at the edge. Miles of waterfront property protected. These are valuable things, leftover remnant structures from the Corps of Engineers, okay? So we then, being a junior salesman, say we have 26 miles of waterfront property, and it's not Florida I'm trying to sell, right? And if I look at it, I say, well, really, you can't tell me I need that wall there anymore. I still need the green bank, because I can see that you don't close that gate and the train goes through it, so the water doesn't get above that. And I don't have to be at IHMC to figure that out, right? So I can see that. But I can also test the other ones, because that was another one. There are 3 of these major ones. And I can see the one on the right, and I can see that it's not safe yet to remove those walls. I have to do other things. So it's a little bit the question or the story I was telling you about. You have to know where you are in the system and when you have to do things before you can. But if you don't have an ambition or a vision that you're going toward, then tell me where we wind up. And it needs to be a mutable vision, but generally we need to get our noses in the same direction. And we have a bit in New Orleans. There are people, we're looking at how we can now fund these projects. These are big projects. These are $100 million level projects, right? 50 million, 100. But there's hope, and the federal government there's some money that maybe. But you can imagine going home, you'd rather go home to that than that wall, right? And the water's somewhere, but you can actually be on the water and live in New Orleans, which is a good thing. Any of you want to come see us. The park is another place that can take water, and the park is now actively looking at how it can peel water out of the neighborhood, store water at City Park, and then how does it make money from that? Because, this is kind of the nature of the park, and it doesn't really hurt it to be wet. Which is better, the car wet or the park wet? Well, that's what parks do for cities in water terms. Okay, the oldest waterway in the city, and I think there are only 2 more projects here. The oldest waterway in the city was the Carondelet Canal. It's now this Lafitte Blueway, and this project is only happening as a bike trail at present. But the reason the city's there, is because the Indians showed the natives showed the white man, the European, that he could come in through the lake, go through that bayou, drag it out, and get out the river, right? That's why that city's there. Well, it goes back to studying history, because if you understand the history of the place, then you can probably save a lot of effort, because there's some short lines that were drawn first. The farmer knows where to put his barn, right? So if you look at this line, which then became a railway embankment, if you store water in it, you can take 5/7 of the water assignment, remember that term, water assignment, and store it right there. It also is the backbone for what we call that circulating system. Remember when I was talking about the dry system? Well, you have to have a way to get water there. It's the shortcut, right? 2 miles. You can get water into 3 other canals and bring the lake into this, and as water levels change, you can play with this all. And then what do you get out of it? Well, I get this chance. Those empty properties on the left aren't going to look like that if that waterway's there, are they? Not long. And so the developer who desperately wants Senator Landry to deliver this project to him, which there are no earmarks, she does understand water management better than other senators. Senator Nelson seems to be interested in this a bit too, but we learn from others. And so this was learning from the past a bit, because that was Basin Street. Remember Basin Street blues and all that? Well, it was a basin there. So these histories and encoding are right there. And we also go back to ultimately, there's a lot of things in a place like this about the head and the mind, but the heart is the key here. This is the last of the projects, but the Congregation of St. Joseph is an order of nuns that have been in New Orleans since the 19th century. They got hit by Katrina and they flooded. They tried to rebuild and they got struck by lightning. And they waited, and then they've said they put their property into this program. We are looking for funding and partners for them, but this is 25 acres. And what this 25 acres can do is relevant to you, because if you look at that dark blue thing and you take the water out of that system that's coming down, look at all the other areas in that watershed that you affected. Because if you take the water out at the top, then everything's clean behind or free behind it. So it's really a matter of trying to manage it from the first, and you can't get it all, but the more you're holding and pulling over. And so what this has is a great effect, and because you have this pump station right there in the middle of that canal going out, when you hit it with water, you really cause problems, and that's the reason that those canal walls couldn't come down, because of the surge of water, because water flows, but if you hit it, a pipe or anything else, you've got a real problem there, a distortion. So this is a key property, opportunity really to teach people about water management, environmental education center, ball fields, because these don't have to, you can do other things. You're not saying it's just a lake now, let the fish swim there. There may be fish. It's almost dinner time. So that's the vision of the city, but it's not just New Orleans, right? So it's a global condition, right? Pensacola is connected through the Gulf of Mexico, around the Gulf of Mexico, to the Gulf Coast, to New Orleans, you've got a much more manageable situation than Miami, don't you? In time. But the Chinese, they always knew. And so how did they manage water? Well, it's about that flow of water and the dimension of it and the way it was used as it stepped down through that landscape. And this is a lower level park in Amsterdam, Wester Park. And, that place is actually much more interesting than the green area away from the water. So it's not a terrible medicine to take. This is not something horrible to take. It actually is healthy, to do this. And it's a place that attracts, I don't know, apparently it's a strange chess game, I don't know. But last is, it's something that the kids have to know. This cannot be left to my generation, right? It's got to be passed into the children. So one of our efforts in New Orleans is to set up programs to teach children. We have a program, Ripple Effect, that we're starting, which is teaching K through 4 kids. And what's the curriculum? That expands, 5 through 8, 9 through 12. But, this is, again, learning to live where we live, knowing where we are, and learning the force of that water and what happens, and, becoming a bit closer to masters of our own fate. So thank you for listening.
Thank you for coming to visit with us. What kind of buy-in are you getting from the Army Corps of Engineers in terms of some of these philosophies?
It's a funny question. The Corps, in some ways, rightly maybe takes a beating from this stuff. When the Dutch came to New Orleans for Dutch Dialogues 1, we did 3 of those big workshops. And the thing that got reported was the Dutch said, well, you say you have a water problem. Where's the water? Right? Where is it? You have a problem. Well, you really have a problem because it's not here. Where is it? But the other thing they said was, and you say the Army's in charge of your water system? And whatever the nature of the people in the Corps, and they're good people in the Corps, I know these people, it's not their mandate. And, one of the things that happened in New Orleans after the floods, after Katrina was, we went through planning exercises with people much further from home than I am from you. And we developed a bit of a civil society where we learned to talk to each other. You can't do this work without working with each other, right? But if it's a chain of command activity, and the Corps individuals would love, there's nothing more they'd love to do than play this game. This board game of New Orleans water system. I've met with them all over the world. They'll get very excited by this. They even look for funding so that they could start doing it. You understand? But somehow the rules have to be written differently, just like they need to be written differently for the architect, the précis of the project. And right now it's lowest first cost. We in Louisiana suffer a lot from the regime that's there. The sediment that's in the river has to be disposed of in the lowest cost way, which means they take all that sediment and pump it out off the continental shelf because that's the lowest way, right? And we need it over there. Don't send it there. It's cheaper. Well, stupid, right? But I don't think in any case you can divorce them from us. In other words, I met the enemy and it's me, right? So I think if we can't make peace with our own army, but if we don't also realize that civil works requires civil process and not a military structure, it's really going to be difficult, okay? The relationship's good individually, but the progress is way too slow, okay? I see 2 hands.
Stormwater carries a lot of pollutants, hydrocarbons, nutrients, and so forth. What type of integration of removal of those contaminants are you working on?
It's a vital question. And, you know, the breadth of what we consider is, to me at least in my mind, a lot. One of the things that is in this program is by slowing it, you're getting less of the pollutants into the water body. The canal edge is a vital place to catch all this pollution. There's a lot of research in the Netherlands about exactly what plant materials abate that runoff and pollution. And we do some of that. You know, the nice thing about living in the South is that the ecosystems are so strong, they can do a lot quickly. The trees, you know, that's basically free. That's considered water quality actually drives a lot of this program, your MS4 programs and EPA's got a stick. They don't use the stick very much, and when they start to, people, vote in other ways. But for goodness sake, it's the drinking water, it's the water. I mean, don't we really want clean water? That was Richard Nixon, right? I mean, Richard Nixon, this is what is homage to the 70s now. I made it to 68 or 72 or something, He was gone by 74, I think. But it's a big piece of it. How do you clean the water before it's in the water body, before it's in Lake Pontchartrain, in our case, before it's in the Gulf of Mexico, in your case, or the Bay? So it's really important. The education aspect that ties to that is people being able to swim in it, because that's a test also. There are lots of things I could show you. There are places that I've seen in the world, that have circular systems to extend that cleaning chain. The longer the chain, the better the chance you have to clean it. It's an edge condition. So you're trying to lengthen it's not so different what you're trying to do to slow the water. The fast concrete course is not my friend. That's pure flushing, I mean, the confusion, this is not your question, but the confusion of highways and waterways, they may be parallel, but they're not the same.
What percentage of the lower Ninth Ward will eventually be vacant and therefore available for water storage?
I gotta say, I'm an architect, and we don't know a lot of things. But we do try to project, and you try to maintain flexibility if you're thinking about this kind of work. The worst thing you can do is, and that's the core problem. They build fixed structures that are not adaptable. One of the possibilities is, because you put in place water systems that are attractive, you actually fill up. In other words, and you take away places you could store water, right? You understand? By virtue of creating attractive condition, then I move people in and I don't have the place to put the water anymore. So there's a balance point. That is not anything close to the situation today. Believe me, there are miles and decades to go before that would ever happen. It's also tied to other questions of the lower Ninth Ward, and maybe this is relevant to you. It was relevant to Bridgeport. The infrastructure that couples it, and back to transportation, if you go to the lower Ninth Ward, you have to cross the industrial canal, right? There's a drawbridge, right? There are 2 drawbridges. It's not convenient to live there, because if I'm trying to get into the city for work, I've got to wait, and then I got a train to cross. So it's the interrelation and the integration of this infrastructure, which I would say my Dutch friends are very good at, So I think that we would like to have that problem in the lower Ninth Ward. I'd like to have that problem in the upper Ninth Ward. We have a really nice version of that. But right now, there's no threat of filling up the city. New Orleans was 630,000 people in the 1960s, right? Before we had New Orleans East, we're less than 400,000 people today. How many people does it take to pay to maintain that flood defense system? Right. So who's going to move to New Orleans?
On that note, let's thank our speakers.
Thank you.